I stood at the back of the auction hall, watching the man I once loved sell my grandfather's land to the highest bidder while holding hands with the woman who hated me most. They thought I was a ghost buried in a classified grave, but they were about to learn that you can't sell what requires a living pulse to unlock. To understand why I was standing in the shadows of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom, wearing a hooded trench coat and nursing a distinct limp, you have to understand where I had been for the last 18 months. My name is Commander Paisley Allen. To the world, and specifically to the United States Navy, I was a decorated officer who had perished during a covert operation in the hostile mountains of a region I am still not legally allowed to name. The official report said my unit was ambushed, the vehicle was incinerated, and no remains were recoverable. A closed casket funeral was held. Flags were folded. Taps was played. My husband, Mark, was handed a triangular case containing the stars and stripes, and he wept on national television. But I wasn't dead. I was held in a hole in the ground, quite literally, for over a year. I survived on dirty water, sheer spite, and the singular thought of returning to the life I had built. I thought about Mark every single day. I thought about our farmhouse on the edge of the Allen Ridge, the 300 acres of pristine forest and rolling hills that had been in my family since the late 1800s. I hallucinated his voice telling me to hold on. I imagined his hands, warm and reassuring, waiting for me on the other side of that hell. When the extraction team finally found me, I was 70 pounds lighter, covered in scars, and barely lucid. The debriefing and medical rehabilitation took 4 months in a secure black site facility in Germany. I was listed as John Doe until my vitals stabilized and my identity could be re-verified without compromising the rest of the unit. I expressly forbade the military from notifying Mark immediately. I wanted to surprise him. I wanted to walk through the front door on my own 2 feet, healed and whole, and see the look of relief wash over his face. I wanted to be the miracle he had prayed for. Instead, I returned to a nightmare that made the torture chamber seem polite. I arrived in our small town 3 days ago. I didn't go straight to the house. I wanted to stop by the grocery store to pick up the ingredients for his favorite meal, a stupidly romantic gesture considering I had technically been dead. That was when I saw the newspaper stand. The front page of the local gazette didn't feature my return, it featured a wedding announcement. Mark Anderson weds Jessica Thorne in lavish ceremony. I froze, the carton of eggs in my hand nearly crushing under my grip. Jessica Thorne, my high school nemesis, the woman who had tried to get me expelled from the Naval Academy by planting drugs in my locker, the woman who had openly flirted with Mark at our engagement party, whispering in his ear while I was in the bathroom. Jessica, who came from old money but had 0 class. My legs, already weak from the rehabilitation, gave out. I sat on the dirty floor of that grocery store, reading the date. They had gotten married 6 months after my funeral. 6 months! I was still bleeding in a cell while he was picking out flower arrangements with her. But the knife twisted deeper when I turned the page. Historic Allen Ridge estate to be auctioned. Developers eyeing prime real estate for luxury condo complex. The air left my lungs. Allen Ridge wasn't just land, it was my blood. My grandfather, Colonel Silas Allen, had left that land to me with strict instructions that it never be developed. It was a sanctuary. It was where he taught me to shoot, to track, to survive, skills that had literally saved my life overseas. Mark knew this. Mark knew that selling the land was the one unforgivable sin in the Allen family book. I abandoned the groceries and drove my rental car to the perimeter of my property. I couldn't get close. There were private security guards at the gate. My gate. A massive banner hung across the wrought iron entrance. Auction of the decade. I didn't storm the gates. That's what an amateur does. That's what an emotional wife does. I am a commander. I assess the tactical situation, I identify the enemy's weakness, and I strike when the probability of success is absolute. I spent the next 48 hours doing reconnaissance. I checked into a Motel 6 2 towns over using an alias. I used my clearance codes, which miraculously had not been fully scrubbed from the shadow servers yet due to the classified nature of my death, to access Mark's financials. It was pathetic. Mark hadn't just moved on, he had cashed out. He had blown through my life insurance policy in 3 months. Gambling debts, sports cars, and, looking at the credit card statements, an endless stream of jewelry and designer clothes for Jessica. He was broke. That was why they were selling the land. They needed the liquid cash to maintain the lifestyle Jessica demanded. This brings us to tonight, the auction. I adjusted the hood of my coat, keeping my head down. The ballroom was filled with sharks, land developers, tech moguls, and foreign investors. The air smelled of expensive cologne and greed. At the front of the room, on a raised dais, sat Mark and Jessica. They looked like royalty. Mark was wearing a tuxedo that fit him a little too well, likely bought with my hazard pay. Jessica was draped in a shimmering gold gown, looking like a trophy that had just been polished. She was whispering something to him, giggling, her hand resting possessively on his knee. He looked nervous, though. He kept checking his watch, sweating slightly under the lights. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a polished British accent, took the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to the jewel of the evening, 300 acres of untouched wilderness featuring natural springs, timber, and the historic Allen homestead. Bidding starts at $5 million. The paddles went up instantly. $5 million, $6 million, $8 million. I watched Mark's face. With every million, his anxiety melted away, replaced by a smug grin. He was doing the math in his head. He was calculating how many more years he could pretend to be a big shot. Jessica was practically vibrating, squeezing his hand so hard her knuckles were white. 12 million, 15 million. The price was astronomical. It was being driven up by 2 rival development firms who wanted to flatten my grandfather's forest to build high-rise apartments and a golf course. Going once, going twice. Sold to the gentleman in the front row for $18.5 million. The gavel slammed down. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. The room erupted in polite applause. Mark and Jessica stood up, hugging each other, performing their victory lap. They shook hands with the buyer, a man named Mr. Sterling, who looked like he would pave over paradise for a parking lot without blinking. Then came the formalities. The auctioneer motioned for them to gather at the signing table to the side of the stage. A notary and a lawyer were waiting. I recognized the lawyer. It was Mr. Henderson, the executor of my grandfather's estate. He was an old man, rigid and by the book. He looked disgusted to be there, but he had a job to do. I moved closer. I needed to be within earshot, but still hidden by the crowd of people filing out or grabbing drinks. I heard Mr. Sterling speak. I have the wire transfer ready. Let's sign the deed and get this over with. I have crews ready to break ground on Monday. Mark picked up the pen, his hand shaking with excitement. Just show me where to sign. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. It was a dry, rasping sound that stopped Mark cold. Mr. Anderson, the lawyer said, his voice amplified slightly by the microphone that was still hot on the table. As I have told you repeatedly during the probate process, this isn't a simple signature. Mark rolled his eyes. We went over this, Henderson. Paisley is dead. I am her sole beneficiary. The land is mine. The death certificate is right there in the file. Yes, Henderson said slowly, the court has declared her deceased. However, the deed to the Allen Bridge estate is not a piece of paper you can simply sign over. Your wife's grandfather, Colonel Allen, placed the physical deed inside a containment unit within the house's panic room. I know that, Mark snapped. We've been trying to drill into that safe for months. We hired locksmiths. We hired industrial welders. Nothing works. But that doesn't matter. You can just issue a new deed. Henderson shook his head. I cannot. The trust is ironclad. The land cannot be transferred unless the original deed is retrieved and countersigned. And the containment unit, well, the colonel was a paranoid man with high-level military clearance. It is a Titan 7 biometric vault. Jessica chimed in, her voice shrill. So? Biometrics means fingerprints, right? Just use, well, you must have her prints on file or something, or override it. Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses. The Titan 7 is DNA coded. It requires a living genetic sample from the bloodline of Silas Allen. Specifically, it requires the palm scan and retinal verification of Commander Paisley Allen. Without that, the vault detects any intrusion attempt as a hostile act. Mr. Sterling, the buyer, looked annoyed. What does that mean, hostile act? It means, Henderson said calmly, that if you attempt to breach the vault without the biometric key, the unit is designed to incinerate its contents. The deed will be ash. If the deed is destroyed, the land reverts to a state conservation trust automatically. That is the fail-safe clause. The room had gone quiet. The people who were lingering near the bar were now listening. Mark was sweating profusely now. Listen, Henderson, she's dead. There is no living pulse. There is no retinal scan. Are you telling me that $18 million is gone because of a ghost? There has to be a override, Jessica screamed. She slammed her hand on the table. This is ridiculous. The woman is rotting in a grave overseas. We are the owners. Mr. Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket. This sounds like a mess, Anderson. I was promised a clean title. If you can't give me the deed, there is no deal, and I will be suing you for breach of contract and wasting my time. No, wait. Mark grabbed Sterling's arm. We can figure this out. We can get a court order to drill it without the failsafe. It's hard-coded, Henderson said. You can't court order a circuit board to not explode. Mark looked like he was going to vomit. Jessica looked like she was going to murder someone. That was my cue. I stepped out from behind the velvet ropes. I walked slowly down the center aisle. The click of my boots on the marble floor was uneven. Clack, shuffle, due to the injury in my right leg. Actually, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent hall, you don't need a drill. Heads turned. Mark froze. He knew that voice. He had heard it every day for 5 years. He turned around slowly, his face draining of all color, until he looked like a sheet of paper. I lowered my hood. Gasps rippled through the room. My face wasn't the pristine one they remembered. I had a jagged scar running from my left temple down to my jawline, a souvenir from the interrogation specialist who had enjoyed his work a little too much. My hair was chopped short and uneven. I looked dangerous. I looked like something that had crawled out of a grave because it had unfinished business. Hello, Mark, I said. Hello, Jessica. Mark's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Paisley? Jessica let out a strangled shriek and stumbled back, knocking over a chair. You're dead, Mark whispered. I buried you. You buried an empty box, I corrected, continuing my slow march toward the stage. You buried a flag. While you were doing that, I was praying that you were safe. I was fighting to get back to you. I reached the bottom of the stairs leading to the dais. I looked up at them. I saw the horror in their eyes. Not the horror of seeing a zombie, but the horror of seeing their fortune evaporate. I hear you're having trouble with my grandfather's safe, I said, my voice icy. Paisley, look, Mark stammered, holding his hands up. I thought you were gone. We all did. I had to move on. I was grieving. Grieving? I gestured to Jessica. You married her 6 months later, and now you're selling my family's legacy to pay off your gambling debts? The crowd murmured. The humiliation was setting in. I walked up the stairs. Mr. Sterling looked between me and Mark, his eyes wide. Is this the wife? Sterling asked. I turned to the buyer. Commander Paisley Allen, United States Navy. And yes, I am the owner of the land you just tried to buy, and I'm afraid the sale is canceled. Sterling looked at Mark with pure fury. You tried to sell me land belonging to a living war hero? Mark was trembling. She was declared dead, legally. I have the papers. I turned to Mr. Henderson. The old lawyer was smiling. It was the first time I had ever seen him smile. Mr. Henderson, I said, I believe the terms of the trust state that if the beneficiary is alive, the property remains under their sole control, regardless of marital status. Correct, Commander, Henderson said, closing his folder. And considering you are standing here, the death clause is null and void. The will is reactivated. The land is yours. And the marriage? I asked, looking at Jessica. Henderson adjusted his glasses again. Well, since you were never actually deceased, your marriage to Mr. Anderson was never legally terminated by death. Therefore, his subsequent marriage to Miss Thorne constitutes bigamy. It is void ab initio, invalid from the start. Jessica screamed. It was a primal, ugly sound. You witch! You ruined everything. You're supposed to be dead. Why couldn't you just stay dead? She lunged at me. It was a mistake. I might have been injured and I might have been recovering, but I was still a trained operative. Before she could even get her hands up, I sidestepped, caught her wrist, and used her own momentum to spin her around, pinning her arm behind her back. I shoved her forward, sending her sprawling across the table, knocking over the pitcher of water onto the contracts. She scrambled up, mascara running, looking like a deranged raccoon. "Security!" Mark yelled. "Get her out of here!" The security guards didn't move. They were looking at me with awe. One of them, an older man who looked like a veteran, gave me a subtle nod. They weren't going to touch a commander who had just come back from the dead. I looked at Mark. He was backed into a corner. "Mark," I said softly, "I survived 18 months of torture. Do you really think you're the victim here?" "Paisley, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "We can fix this. I still love you. I only did this because I was so lost without you." "Jessica!" She took advantage of me and my grief. Jessica gasped. "You lying snake. You told me you hated her. You told me you were glad she was gone so you could finally cash in." They started screaming at each other, the perfect couple disintegrating in front of 200 of the city's elite. It was beautiful. I turned to Mr. Henderson. "I'm ready to go home now. I assume the locks have been changed?" "I'm afraid so," Henderson said, "but I imagine you can get in." "I have the biometric key right here," I said, tapping my temple, "and I have a feeling the vault needs to be audited." I walked away from the podium. I didn't look back at Mark as he wept, not for me, but for the $18 million that had just vanished. I didn't look back at Jessica as she realized she wasn't a wife, but a mistress to a broke bigamist. The exit was slow. People parted for me like the Red Sea. Mr. Sterling caught me near the door. "Commander," he said respectfully, "I had no idea." "I know," I said, "but take a word of advice. Don't try to buy Allen Ridge again. It's not for sale. Not now. Not ever." I walked out into the cool night air. I called a taxi to take me to the local police station. I had to file a report regarding identity theft, fraud, and bigamy. After that, I would go to my farm. I arrived at the house at midnight. The for sale sign was planted in the front lawn. I ripped it out of the ground and threw it into the ditch. The front door was locked, but I broke the window pane and reached in. It was my house. I wasn't breaking and entering. I was coming home. I walked through the empty hallway. They had sold most of the furniture. My grandfather's antique clock was gone. The pictures of my parents were gone, replaced by abstract art that looked like vomit on canvas. I went to the study. I pushed the bookshelf aside to reveal the steel door of the panic room. I entered the code to the outer door. Mark had changed it, but he was lazy. He had used his birthday. Idiot. Inside, the Titan 7 vault sat in the corner, humming softly. The red light blinked at me. I placed my palm on the scanner. I leaned forward for the retinal scan. A green light swept over my eye. The machine beeped. A robotic voice filled the room. "Identity confirmed. Welcome back, Commander Allen." The heavy bolts retracted with a satisfying clink. I opened the door. Inside, the deed lay untouched, sitting next to my grandfather's service pistol and a bottle of 1945 whiskey. I took the whiskey. I poured a glass. I sat on the floor of the panic room, and finally, after 18 months of holding it together, I let myself cry. I cried for the marriage that was a lie. I cried for the time I had lost. But the tears didn't last long. By morning, the soldier was back in charge. The fallout was swift and brutal. Because I was alive, Mark's access to my accounts was retroactively considered fraud. The bank froze everything. Since he had spent money that wasn't legally his, he was liable for every cent. The creditors for his gambling debts descended on him like vultures. He tried to come to the house once, begging, crying, banging on the door. I called the sheriff. The sheriff, a man who had served with my father, was all too happy to drag Mark off the property for trespassing. Jessica fared no better. The social humiliation destroyed her. Being exposed as a gold-digging bigamist meant she was a pariah in the social circles she valued so much. Last I heard, she moved to the next state over, trying to find another rich idiot to leech off of. As for the legal battle, it was short. The judge looked at the timeline, looked at the fraud, and annulled their marriage. Then he granted me a divorce from Mark on the grounds of adultery and cruel and inhumane treatment. I got everything. Mark got a court-appointed debt consolidation plan and a studio apartment above a bowling alley. I'm still living at Allen Ridge. I retired from active duty. I spend my days fixing up the house, tending to the land, and hiking the trails my grandfather loved. I have my scars. I have a limp that flares up when it rains. I have nightmares sometimes about the hole in the ground. But every morning, I walk out onto my porch, coffee in hand, and I look out at the mist rising over the trees. I look at the land that they tried to turn into a parking lot. They thought I was a ghost. They thought I was a memory they could erase with a signature and a gavel. But they forgot the most important lesson my grandfather ever taught me. The land remembers, and so do I. I am Paisley Allen. I am alive, and I am exactly where I belong.